All right, hey everyone. This is the first time I've been messing with this with a lot of people on it, so bear with me. It's going to be kind of new. But this is Google Hangouts Air, so we're going to do a live kind of a broadcast and answer some questions you guys have been asking. So let's do that. First question up was, has it started yet? So from Robert Green, yes, it has started. Kind of done with that question. Moving on. What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? I'm not going to answer that question, but that was hilarious. Let's go with this question here. What is the best thing to do for a Gen 2 motor's gearing, timing, or for speed? Okay, this is kind of depending on the track, layout, car, things of this nature. Typically what I do is look at the track layout. If it's tight and a lot of 180-degree turns or short run-ups to jumps, for example, on off-road, or tight-ass sections in on-road, typically less motor timing will give you more torque. So that's usually what you want to run with that kind of a thing. Always gear for lap times though, and that goes with your motor setup, your speed controller setup, your gearing, everything. You're chasing the lowest lap time that you can get consecutively. So always look at that. Lap times, motor temperature, things of that nature. That's what you're looking for. You want your motor to finish strong, which means you've got to have your motor temperature in check. Gearing is obviously affecting that. Motor time is obviously affecting that. And always err on the side of caution. Start with lower motor timing until you figure out your gearing. Then you can slowly increase the timing, and as you do that, for about every 5 to 10 degrees of timing you increase, you're going to drop a pinion on like a 48 pitch car. So that's pretty much how I go from that. Let's answer this one next from Tom Franquito. Can a stator wear out if you race just about every week? How often should you replace the motor, or how can you just replace the parts? Okay, that's a good question. So on a brushless motor, the stator doesn't technically wear. You're looking at just the wraps of wire around a stack of iron, basically. There's nothing wearing there because there's no contact points. In a brushless motor, the only contact points are the rotor to the bearing, bearing to the case. So essentially, as long as the bearings are doing their job and spinning freely, there's essentially no wear, except in the case of overheating. So if you repeatedly run your motor too hot, you'll eventually soften the magnetism in the rotor. So in other words, if you've got a brushless motor, for example, that used to be really good but feels like it's gotten flat over time, a new rotor typically will make that a brand new motor again. I always recommend replacing the bearings at the same time, because typically that means if you've overheated the rotor enough, you've also got the bearings really hot. It's a good idea to replace them, plus you're right there. So it's kind of a good little bit of insurance. Turn your volume on mute. Okay, so I got us saying again a lot of feedback, so hopefully that sounds better now. Here's a question from Casey Retke. Looking for a proper boosted setting on an 8 scale, trying to simulate a boosted 17.5. Okay, that's a little different to do. We don't boost 8 scale. We do adjust the timing, and we have control over the start and end RPMs of that setup. So in an 8 scale electric buggy, typically the problem is too much bottom end power or torque. So what you're looking to do is control that wheel speed or that initial torque. So the way you do that with a Tekin system is you use your current limiter, the gearing, and obviously the proper KV. Now, something you got to understand with KV is that it needs to be matched up with your battery. So because 8 scale is typically 4S in most conditions, you're going to run a 4S. So KV is anywhere between 1700 kV and 2200 kV. For us, that means there's 1700 kV, 1900 kV, and 2050. We also have the T8Is, which are indoor motors typically. They have a 1950 kV there. That is a softer motor. If you're running outdoors on a really loose track, a lot of times a regular full-size T8 is just a handful. There's just so much torque there that even if you turn the current limiter down to 25%, you might have overgeared a tooth to try to control wheel speed. It's just still too much. So what a lot of guys have tried, even the pro guys like Lutz and Drake and these guys, they tried the 1950 T8i, which is substantially lighter than the T8. then what you have to focus on is, because it's an indoor motor and it's typically meant for cars like the Pro Light class, which is under the 3,200 gram minimum weight, you need to get your 8 scale at minimum weight. So you're looking to get your 8 scale electric car down to 3,200 grams. If you do that, you can run the T8i outdoors, but you understand the gearing is going to be slightly different than a standard T8. If you can keep that temp under 200 degrees for a full 10 or 11 minute main, you're dialed. And I've actually done it a couple different times at some really big racetracks, like at Silver Dollar Raceway where the Worlds were. They had a straightaway which I think was a 200-foot long, and I had no problems with speed. The track conditions were really kind of hit or miss depending on the corner. There was good traction in some, but kind of loose in others. And I prefer that setup all around. And my car was literally 3,215 grams hitting the track. I had no problems making run time. I could get 12 minutes on a 4300 4S, and the car was light. It was drivable, and that's actually my preferred setup. It just depends on the car I'm running at the time. But a lightweight 8 scale, you do have options when it comes to choosing motors, so try that. If you have a motor now and it's a full-size T8, for example, what you then want to start messing with is timing. And if you've got a 0 timing, you're really stuck to playing with the throttle minimum and the current limiter, and start turning those down until you can get a hold of it. And if it's still too much, throttle curve is the next thing I'd recommend start to play with. Let's see. Okay, next question is from Robert Green. Why would there be a big difference in a Gen 1 7.5 and a Gen 2 7.5? Both motors no timing. Are the Gen 1 is more powerful than the Gen 2 and has more top end? Technically, the Gen 2 motor, it should be quieter, it should be smoother. Their power-wise will be very similar. My first question would be, do the rotors measure the same? So for example, do you have a weak rotor in your Generation 2? The timing are slightly different between the two, but you're saying you've turned it down to no timing, I'm assuming, on the can. And if that's the case, the first thing I would look at is the strength of the Gen 2 rotor. You're going to need a Gauss meter for that, so something like the iGauss from Trinity. MMS meter, Phantom makes one. There's a couple of it out in the market, but that'd be the first thing I would look at. Without having that information, I really wouldn't know what to tell you other than something might be wrong with your Gen 2 7.5, and I would probably recommend sending it into service and having it checked. Here's a good question from Roy Palmer. What are your target temps for the 4300 Pro 4 HD and Gen 2 with a good temp range? Okay, so assuming that you're talking about using these in a short course truck, or for that matter a 2S 8 scale light buggy, typically what you'd want to do is keep your motor as best you can under 200 degrees, and your speed controller, to be quite honest, if you're running an RX-8 Gen 2 with a fan, you're not going to have a heat issue with that speed controller. If you're not running the fan, in which most conditions you may not have to, use a temp monitor on the LED tree and make sure that it's at least 6 LEDs or lower. As long as your 6 lights are lower, after a full run at race speed, your speed controller is completely fine. If you think you might be having heat issues, and you certainly can sometimes in 2S with short course, it is the worst load we have in RC racing right now. Run the fan on the speed controller, and as long as the fan's in operational condition, you won't have speed controller heat issues. You can focus on the motor. A lot of times, motor temp, again, just keep it under 200 degrees and everything should be fine. Always check your motor temps at race speed. So if you're practicing and you have a bunch of crashes, or the track's not in the same condition it is that you would normally race in, you might practice for a full run on a battery, so say 8 minutes, and your motor might come off at 175 degrees, but then when you go to a race, it might come off at 210. So you're going to be harder on the gas in a race, you're going to be harder on the brakes in a race, you're going to just be punched more in a race. So try to practice at a race speed to find the right gearing and make sure your motor temp's good. Still has a bad echo. Okay, so we'll keep going on the 17 by boosted running cool, where 8 scale runs hot, from Casey. With an 8 scale motor, you're also looking at a 4-pole 12 slot motor versus a typical 10 scale motor, which is 2-pole 3 slot. So comparing the two, aside from temperatures and boosting, you really are boosting a different type of motor. It would almost be like comparing boost on a 4-cylinder versus boost on an 8 scale. Yes, both will make more power, but they both have an Achilles heel depending on the system. Typically, for example, you don't boost a huge displacement engine just because there's other ways to benefit more power. Typically speaking, if your 8 scale system motor-wise is running hot, chances are you're under-geared. So my first question would be, how long is the straightaway, which car are you running, and what gearing are you running? If you got an idea about how long the straightaway is, that would be helpful. And I can answer that question here in a little bit. We'll come back to it. All right, Robert, so on your Gen 2 7.5, if it's only been run 4 times, I realize that technically everything should be completely fine. However, I have seen a motor run through QA and still, by the time it gets to the customer, have a weak or soft rotor. I don't know if it's getting zapped by an X-ray machine. I don't know exactly how it got to that end user with a weak rotor, but I've seen it. If you want to shoot me an email at rpike@teamtekin.com, I'll see if I can find a team driver that might have a spare rotor around, so you can swap it out and test it. Or we can try to find someone local that has a Gauss meter so we can actually measure it. But shoot me an email about that. We'll take care of it. That's a big question. Okay. So Lance McDonald, one of our team drivers for Peyton McDonald's dad, just tell all our 17 miles for Nats, what should I be looking for in amp draw, higher, better, RPM, and KV? Okay, so because I know Peyton typically runs off-road, typically when I run 17.5 stock in off-road, I know a lot of guys in oval and a lot of guys in on-road are looking for free rev amp draw. That's great when comparing one motor to the other because they're all slight tolerances in timing, sensor gap, position on the board where the sensors were mounted, things of this nature. Yes, the amp draw can be affected by the rotor. Yes, it can be affected by the resistance of the stator. However, you're not going to find giant variances in that. So what I typically do is I know that our Gen 2 motor runs best between 25 and 30 degrees of can timing. I don't really care about the amp draw because in stock, it doesn't really matter. We're going to have more than enough battery than we need, so amp draw and runtime isn't an issue. I'm looking for lap times and overall temp. Can you make the full run, achieving the best lap times I can get with the gearing and timing settings without fading at the end? So if I find a car, for example, that can make the lap times, but let's assume it's a 6-minute race, and he's fading at the 4.5-minute mark really, really hard, and I know it's not the battery, typically that means we're on the fringe of a good setup or slightly overdone. The first thing I will usually do is slightly reduce the timing because that generally means he's bogging it down in the corners with the gear he's pulling, but his lap time will show that that gear's on par. So I will just, the smallest amount of timing change will be a significant change on the can and the temp. And again, this is why the data logging feature of the RS Gen 2 and the RSX and the RX-8 Gen 2 are really nice to have because you can make those tiny, tiny changes, go out, run the run compared to the last run you did and see if it made a change. The other thing you look at a lot of times in stock racing is that these guys gear these things really, really tall, and they're actually never topping out the motor. And you can see this on the RPM range, and maybe I'll tap into the Tekin Clinic thing a little bit here, and we'll go over one of those if there's enough of you guys interested. We can go over the Tekin Clinic in a couple of days. I'll show you a couple of screenshots of some data logger stuff that you can tell is over geared versus when it looks properly geared. So I'll touch back on that in a little bit. Okay, so here's another good question. Running 8-scale buggy, running 2 7.4 volt packs in series, do you find this puts a lot of strain on the packs compared to just one 4S? No, not at all. Essentially, a 4S pack, 9 times out of 10, is literally 2 2S packs jammed into a 4S case. The wire between the 2 2S packs does nothing other than bridge the electrical connectivity gap that it needs to double the voltage, and you're running the same pack. So, for example, I run Protex. If I run 2 4300 shorties, versus one single 4S 4300, the pack is going to be the same. The only thing that may happen, and it's pretty minimal, but a lot of times you'll get a slight unbalance between the two packs. And a lot of this just has to do with resistance of the wires, length of the wires, and things like this. But for the most part, you're never going to notice a difference. Okay, so running a Gen 2 RX-8 and a 1900, what do you find is the best settings? I love these questions. Okay, there's no best settings. There are settings that work for each driver. Typically, the default timing profile, which is what the speed controller comes with, is what I've settled on personally, which is kind of one of the reasons why it's default. It's a collaboration between everyone at Teak and some of our pro drivers, what they've liked, what we've liked. So that's the base setting. I rarely deviate from that, with the exception of my brake settings. I will always run my brake minimum at 0, and I will adjust my brakes on the track. The reason why I adjust the brake strength in the speed controller is, for example, if I set my brake strength at 80% on the speedo, then I can then use my EPAs on my transmitter to go up to 100%. I'll get more resolution that way, versus if I have my brake strength turned up to 100%, then each step is only 1 to 1. If I turn it down to 80, now my each step is, say, for example, 0.7 of a step versus a full step. So rarely in 8 scale do we ever need 100% brake strength. I mean, most of the time, even 80 is overkill. It's okay for truggy, but for example, I'll set my brake strength at 80 on my truggy and 70 on my buggy, and then use my EPAs to turn them down after that. Other things to mess with is current limiter. I try to run my current limiter at least at 80, sometimes lower. Again, depends on wheel spin. Voltage cutoff's pretty standard. I run 4S. Timing, I generally don't run any unless I'm running my T8i indoor setup on a really big outdoor track, in which case then I will add some timing advance. But I won't have the RPM start until about 15,000 to 20,000, and I'll have them end somewhere around 40,000, just to allow me to run a slightly lower gear for the infield, because that motor lacks some torque compared to the full-size T8. But then the timing lets it wrap out harder on the straightaway and longer for those long straights, so I get to keep up on the straightaway with the full-size motor. Right, so Lance makes a good point. He is pointing out the fact that, for those of you who don't know, when you add motor timing, you actually increase the KV or the RPM of the motor and lose some torque. It's a minor torque loss. It's not as much as you would think, but the reason why every time you add timing, you need to change your gearing is you don't want to overheat the motor. Even the smallest 5 to 10 degree bump in motor timing can add 30 to 40 degrees of motor temperature at the end of the run, mostly because if you get to that point where you are over-timed for the amount of gear you're pulling, you are overworking the motor in a constant state, and it'll get really hot really fast. Okay, here's another good question from Tom. Question is, can you tune with a larger rotor in 1/10 scale mod motor? What will it do? I went from a 12.3 to a 13, but it felt soft to me. Did not give me the torque I thought it would, 7.5 for example. So our 7.5 motor, the Gen 2 comes with a 13 millimeter rotor. It's not a high torque, but just a 13 millimeter rotor. If you were, for example, to drop in, let's say, a 12.3 standard rotor in that motor, you would gain RPM, but you would lose torque. Typically, the bigger rotor provides more torque. However, you can get to a point where the rotor's size actually bogs the motor's acceleration down because of its weight, and it lowers the KV substantially, especially in mod motors. So, for example, he's using a 7.5. If you took a 7.5 that normally has a 13 millimeter rotor in it, and let's say put a 13 millimeter high torque rotor in it, which is about 20% stronger in Gauss strength or rotor strength, you would see about 20% reduction, maybe not 20, more like 10% reduction in KV, which means the motor won't accelerate as hard, and to overcompensate for that, you might have to gear up a tooth or two to get that rip back. A lot of times what we find the pro guys doing is they'll take, say, a 5.5 motor and four-wheel drive buggy that is just a little absurd on the bottom end. They'll actually put a smaller rotor in it. So that motor also comes with a 13 millimeter rotor from us, but they'll drop in a 12.5 high torque. So it gets rid of some of the absurdly hard acceleration on the bottom end, but it still has enough strength to give them the mid-range they want and the top end that they want. Okay, so here's a long question I've been saving. Can I explain boost, timing, and turbo? When will each be used? I'm interested in regards to 8-scale buggy and short course truck. He's talking about a 4-wheel drive short course truck. So typically, the RX-8 Gen 2 speed controller does not have timing boost. It has timing advance. which is similar but different. I'll explain it really quick. The RX-8 does not run sensored only mode. It runs dual mode exclusively. And what this allows us to do is we monitor the sensor's position for rotor knowledge. In other words, the reason why our systems never cog is because we know exactly what position the rotor is in regards to the ABC phases at all times. We're monitoring it. However, in dual mode, we do not base our timing calculations off of the rotor's position using the motor sensors. In other words, we're using our timing calculations based off the exact firing point of the phase, not the sensor position, which is why on our 8-scale motors and our 4-pole four-wheel drive short course motors, the motor can timing is not adjustable, because when you're running it with an RX-8, that won't make a difference. Even if you adjusted it all the way up, the speed controller wouldn't make a change because we're not utilizing it for timing calculations. Versus sensored only mode, which is where you get timing boost and turbo, we are using the sensor's physical position in the motor to help determine timing, overall timing. So in 8-scale, you would never run a boosted setup. At least we would never recommend it, which is why none of the speed controllers that we make for 8-scale have boost. For 4-wheel drive short course, same thing. If you're running a 4-pole motor, there's really no reason to boost it. It's got enough torque and enough power to overcome any need for boost or timing now, or excuse me, turbo. The way timing boost works is it takes the motor's position as mechanical timing, and then on top of that starts boosting by advancing the firing time on the phases of the motor via the speed controller. So it's preemptively firing this thing to get it to advance and change the kV of the motor. This is why we don't want this in 8-scale, because when you typically do this in 10-scale, you're increasing the amp draw 2-fold, 3-fold. So a 17.5 motor in blinky mode, for example, that may only draw 30 amps. If you boost it, even only 20 degrees, it might draw 60 amps, because you're taking a motor that's going from 2,000 kV and boosting it to make it turn 4,000 kV, for example. That's a huge increase in amp draw, which is why we don't do it in 8-scale, because an 8-scale motor, for example, in the 1900, is a 1.5 turn motor. You don't want to boost a 1.5 turn motor. Bad things will happen, and most of the time they'll happen to your batteries. So an 8-scale motor might ask for 100 amps, but if you boost it, it would ask for 200 amps, and none of the stuff that we're using is going to give out 200 amps for a long period of time, which is why we don't do it. Turbo can be handy, but most of the time it's on a track that, for example, has an extremely tight infield, but then out of nowhere a really, really long straightaway. So you don't want to overtime for the infield sections. When you do this, a lot of amp draw, excessive motor heat, and it actually bogs the acceleration of the car down. It's kind of hard to explain on a clip like this, but if I was at a racetrack and I know that the guys are boosting, I can actually watch it happen and I can show it to you. All right, cool. One of our first rock crawler questions. Saying hi to Brian Parker. What's going on, man? With more scale drivers switching to censored brushless systems, what are your suggestions on waterproofing? Okay, we are looking at a waterproofing stuff, but it's nothing I can talk about yet as far as future products go. However, because a lot of scale guys are going to, for example, like our Rock 412 brushless motor, which is censored brushless, the best thing you can do to waterproof these things is, when it comes to water, you can't really waterproof anything. You can manage it, so you can prevent it from getting it to where you want it to go. So if I was waterproofing, say for example, a Rock 412 motor, what I would actually do is get like a balloon going around the back side of it or some other heavy vinyl material and wrapping the motor and having the sensor harness and ABC wires come out of the top of this thing to where I could mitigate the water from getting into it. In other words, create a motor sock and a snorkel that would go up to a higher point so it's always out of the water. What you've got to watch out for is if water actually is able to bridge any of the sensor harness cables, it can short out the BEC, it can short out Hall effect sensor field inputs. It can do a lot of damage. The ABC wires aren't such a problem so much because we're not really shorting out those enough to cause a problem. It's the sensors. So the best thing you can do, you can use electronically approved silicone, helps a lot. You can take the motor apart, you can lightly coat the front and rear end bells and prevent water going into those. But the biggest problem we find in brushless censored stuff, and as far as water submersion goes, is the external sensor port itself. So what I would recommend doing is doing your best to somehow wrap that in a waterproof, vinyl material or some kind of a stretch rubber. Sometimes you can find those at pool shops, to like a patch, and literally wrap that up to where it travels up the sensor harness, and the sensor harness is routed in an upward motion like a snorkel would be on a real four-wheel drive off-road vehicle, where the intake has to be for example, the intake can be submerged, but the air is breathing. It's breathing. It's coming up from a higher air source. Same type of feature. So we're kind of already wrapped up on the questions that we had preemptively asked. So what other questions do you guys have for me? Is it hard on the RX-8 Gen 2 2250 and a TLR 3.0E, I'm assuming a Truggy, to current limit to 40 to 50% and EPA in the radio 85? It is geared at 1348 and is still a little warm, not at 200 degrees, but probably 170. Way too much motor. Okay, I'm going to answer this two ways because you don't tell me if it's a buggy or a Truggy. I'm going to assume it's a buggy only because you didn't say it was otherwise. So on 4S and a 2250, that's a lot of motor for an 8-scale buggy. On 4S, what I wouldn't do is undergear it, which is what you're doing now. Even with that kV of a motor, even on 4S, I know it's going to be a handful, trying to run 1348 is severely undergearing it. I would probably run a 14 or even a 15. Turning your EPAs down on the transmitter is okay, but it's obviously showing you that you've got the wrong motor in the car. Same with the gearing being that far off. To my knowledge, the 3.0E car actually has a 43 or a 44 tooth spur, so I'd make sure that that's accurate as far as having the 48 tooth spur, which is actually why I only thought maybe you're running a Truggy. Now, the current limiter doesn't hurt the car at all. It actually helps in some cases. It also makes the battery last a little bit longer. Turning on EPAs doesn't hurt anything long term, but I always say that if you're having to do that, you basically got a band-aid on a problem, and it's a temporary fix until you get the right motor for that car and setup. Now, if this is an E-Truggy, the 48 tooth spur gear might be accurate, and still though you're undergeared. E-Truggy low C with a 48 tooth spur should be around a 14 or 15 tooth for a typical 8-scale track. And again, undergearing is going to make it run hotter. So anytime you've got an undergeared car, it makes the motor run hot, the speeder run hot, and it uses a lot of milliamp hours out of your battery. So I would strongly suggest next time you run the car, run it to get a baseline. Check the temperatures at the end of the run, say for example 10 minutes. When you go to charge your battery back up, make a note of how many milliamp hours it takes. So for example, if it's a 5,000 and it takes 4,000 milliamp hours on that run, after you change the pinion to say for example a 15 tooth, go run it again. Check the temps at 10 minutes, and then check the milliamp hours. I would bet that your milliamp hour usage goes from, say, for example, 4,000, which is what we were using before. I bet it goes down to 3,500 to even 3,300, and the car is going to be faster. So you're not going to be on the gas as long as you were when it was being undergeared. Undergearing in 8-scale is as bad, if not sometimes worse, than overgearing them. So definitely tread softly on that kind of a thing. So question about current limiting, can I explain it? The best way I explain current limiting is I explain it as my background's automotive, so I kind of attribute it to traction control without having it being active. In other words, current limiter softens the amount of power being given to the motor by the speed controller for the initial acceleration. So we're monitoring, for example, throttle position, motor RPMs, and we basically determined if you're falling within that current limiter window that you've set versus with your percentage, that will soften that hit. So I attribute it to either from a dead stop, current limiter is obviously active, or the slower corners, 180 degree corners, tight 90 degree corners where you're really scrubbing speed. That's where the current limiter happens. It can be affected on really big jumps where you lock the tires up to where the tires are completely stopped in the air. Current limiter does get back involved at some point, but if you're doing such a drastic maneuver, chances are you kind of want it there, because electric 8-scale, for example, comes to mind. Those are extremely sensitive in mid-air flight. It just softens the initial hit. So in 8-scale, if you've got a lot of wheel spin, where you're blowing the tires off under acceleration, current limiter can be a big change for that. It's definitely helpful. But I've also learned that make sure your center diff fluid's accurate for the car. 8-scales are extremely overpowered electric versus their nitro counterparts. So if the nitro guys are running 7,000 center diff oil on that track, you might need to run 10,000 in the same car because you have so much more torque than they have. So current limiter doesn't typically affect top speed directly, other than the fact that it could improve your acceleration getting onto the straightaway. So that's basically how that affects that. Okay, so Robert says it's 1345 gearing, but we still need to know if it's, okay, he does answer another question, so it's a buggy. So yeah, same question. If it's a buggy, you're severely undergeared, and I would either suggest changing the gearing and reducing even more EPA, but ultimately you really just need to get the right motor for that car. Typical 8-scale cars on 4S, if they're running on a typical outdoor track, guys like 1700s, 1900s, and 2050s. Indoors, 1700s and 1900s. And obviously the T8i, which is a 1950. And again, only run the 1950 if you're able to get your 8-scale electric car down or near minimum weight to run that motor. Yeah, so yes, awesome shirt. Thanks for the shirt, Parker. Gearing for a specific track is one thing. The scale of your driver that will drive for 2 to 4 hours continues. How should the driver determine the best gearing for those kind of run times? Okay, so I actually got to go to Axial Fest this year, which is awesome, by the way. Had a lot of fun. And I did run a Rock 412 in the Wraith class. And I wasn't really sure where to gear this either. And so what I ended up doing was kind of trying to do some tests on what percentage of throttle I found myself driving in while crawling on the rocks versus how much time I spent driving wide open throttle between one gate and the next. So that's kind of where I would do gearing for a crawler. I would obviously set the car up for crawling first because that's the most important part of rock crawling and G6 and all that stuff. And then I would work on top speed. The Rock 412 motor has a lot of torque for a 10-scale motor that size. It's 4-pole, it's 12 slot. It was designed for rock crawling, so the torque's pretty immense. So gear it for your scaler to where you are comfortable crawling with it. I geared my Wraith, for example, with a 18 or 19 tooth pinion on it with a stock spur. So on your scale crawler, because your tires are smaller and the same transmission, just gear to where you are most comfortable with when it's doing the rock crawling, where you're happiest with the low end power, the wheel speed, things of that nature. That point forward, generally what I've found or we've found is that if once they're happy with the crawler speed, they're almost always happy with the top speed going from gate to gate. Stock gearing or comparable gearing, I would say gear it comparatively to a 2S 35 turn setup and go from there. That's the best place to start for that. Run times, gearing can affect the run times, but the worst part about run time is, again, if you're severely undergeared, which again you'll have no wheel speed with brushless stuff, and being overgeared, you may not see that right away, but you'll have a car that just has way too much top speed, and you don't have the resolution while rock crawling with an overgeared car typically. It jumps too much. Okay, you talked about controlling brake from ESC and not the transmitter. Can you explain this a bit more? I run two-wheel drive short course. I used to run 60 to 80% from ESC. Lately run 100%. So I'm not exactly sure what speed controller you're running, Tom, but I'm going to assume it's a Generation 2 controller at this point. There's a couple settings that I work on all my two-wheel drive off-road vehicles, actually all my cars, period, for that matter. But in two-wheel drive, you're going to be running a sensor setup most likely, or a sensored-only setup. What you're going to look for is brake minimum and the brake strength, as well as active brake and drag brake. And I'll go over this one at a time. Brake minimum is the amount of brake power that's initially given to the motor with the first step of push brake. In other words, push brake is when you push with your trigger. So that's what push brake is to us. So brake minimum is the amount of brake power that goes to the motor from 0, which is neutral, to the very first step of push brake, that initial brake hit. Now drag brake is obviously drag brake. Drag brake is only engaged when the speed controller sees a neutral signal from you, the user. So if you're into push brake at all, there's no drag brake being applied. I set that up basically for the end of the straightaway, and I don't run drag brake a whole lot, but if I do run drag brake, I will basically set it up to where my car is consistently able to apex the end of the straightaway without any input from me, just for lap time consistency. I rarely use it because I would rather have control over it and not rely on the car always going back to neutral. It's just not the way I drive, but that's exactly how that works. Now, brake strength is, again, something you set up, depends on the motor, depends on the driver, it depends on how much brake you want, it depends on your radio. I generally always recommend everyone calibrate their speed controllers with their EPAs or travel, in the case of Spectrum, to 100%. And the reason why I do this is that way when you talk to your buddy or you talk to one of us and I say, hey, I've got my brakes turned down 20%, you're talking the same figure. If you've got a guy who, for example, calibrates at 100 on travel at an EPA, versus a guy who's got the exact same radio and he's calibrated at 150%, his percentage won't match yours. He'll actually have to turn his EPAs down a lot further than you will to attain the same brake strength setting. Now, brake strength on my 10 scale stuff, I almost always set it up to 90 on all my two-wheel drive cars and on 100% on only my four-wheel drive buggy, just because I can typically use more brakes on that. My four-wheel drive short course, for example, is a 4-pole setup, so all my 4-pole setups are 80 and lower. And again, on a four-wheel drive short course truck, I probably have it set to 80, but then I use my EPAs to turn it down. Most of the time, my EPAs I find are in the 70% range, 70 to 75, around that area, depends on the track. Active brake is a brake multiplier that is used when we do a panic or a slap brake. In other words, it's still push brake, but it's going from 0 to say 70% or higher, which we would consider a panic or a slap. And we did do that a lot in off-road, where if your car's coming up and you need to slap the nose down, so for example in two-wheel drive short courses, which is what you run, my two-wheel drive short course active brake setting, even in mod, is at least 1, sometimes 2. And it depends on if I have a lot of jumps that have to go up and a lot of immediate down, in other words, they're very sharp ups and downs, I'll run a higher active brake setting. If I've got a track that flows and there isn't really a jump where I need to slap the front end down immediately and I've got time to correct, I might have it at 1 or even 0 sometimes, and it depends on the car. My two-wheel drive buggy, my active brake is always off. My four-wheel drive buggy, my active brake is either off or at 1. Again, this depends on the track. My two-wheel drive short course usually at 1 or sometimes 2. Especially in mod short course, because a short course, two-wheel drive short course, we don't have the ability to snap the front end down. There's no power or inertia. So we need all the braking we can typically get. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to set your brake strength for everywhere else on the track, for as far as infield sections, into the straightaway, and that's your normal push brake. But if you have a panic brake, or in other words a slap, which is what you would do to correct the nose or the attitude of the car going over the jump, the active brake's there to make it even stronger and help you with that. So a lot of guys on a lot of controllers that we used to see was they would set their push brake up to where it was just strong enough to be effective off the end of the straightaway, but then they would find, for example, they needed a little bit more braking on the infield. If you set your brakes up like that, active brake is your friend, because then you can hit your full push brake coming off the straightaway. But if you're in a panic area where you need to slap brakes to stop because of traffic or again a jump, active brake multiplies that brake strength setting and gives you a little bit extra brake power. So hopefully that answers your question. Jamie, I need more of a question than just four-wheel drive buggy, but come back and ask a better question. Stock setup. So stock setup. Why RSX is running stock? Okay, so generally speaking, in stock, we make a stock speed controller with the RS Gen 2 spec, the RS Gen 2, and the RSX, which is all our Generation 2 controllers. All of them are roar legal and blinky mode. I get this question a lot. Is one of them better than the other when it comes to regards to racing stock? The answer is typically no, but there's obviously some variances between the two. You're looking at things like internal resistance or on resistance, depending on how it's listed. That can have an effect in the most minuscule ways. However, it's definitely there. For example, if I have a 17.5 two-wheel drive buggy and there's an RS spec in one and the identical buggy and setup is in an RS Gen 2 in the other, will there be any difference? The answer is going to be no. We're not drawing enough amp load in either of those cars to overwhelm the speed controller enough to where it would affect performance. Now, Lance is asking a next question about him, the RSX being a little bit more punchier, for example, in stock versus an RS Gen 2. The likelihood of that happening is probably slim to none. However, the RSX does have less on resistance than the RS Gen 2, but again, it's a very, very small percentage. I doubt that's probably the issue. My guess is that the settings between the two are different. So the RS Gen 2 default is slightly different than the RSX default settings. So you have to really make sure you're comparing apples to apples there. If you take an RS Gen 2 with default settings versus the RSX with default settings, you're not comparing the same thing. Things like throttle minimum, current limiter, those are the things that need to make sure that 100% that they match before you test those two speed controllers back to back. Okay, dual mode censored. I have run the same timing motor ESC and equal to timing advance, let's say 20 degrees. Dual mode is always smoother. Okay, so yes, and for example, a lot of guys don't run dual mode in 10 scale off-road, especially in mod. I'm not really sure why that is, because I actually prefer it. And again, it's going back to how the speed controller adjusts timing in relationship to the motor and that whole overall power package. Because we're Tekin and we give you the ability to do both, I recommend highly trying this, especially in four-wheel drive mod buggy, for example. So I run a 22.4 Losi with a 6.5 and an RSX. I have all my profiles, obviously the default profile stored, but I also have two custom profiles. You get to have them. They're C1 and C2. C1 is censored only custom, and C2 is dual mode custom. And what I recommend everyone try is, blinky mode. So go out in blinky mode, which is timing profile 1. Go out in blinky mode, run your car. Come back and change your speed controller over to C2. You can use the buttons, you can use your Android device, you can use a hotwire with a laptop, whatever you want to do. And then go run the car in that mode. And you need to do this when your motor timing is set to 0, mechanical timing on the can. So run the cars that way. You'll notice that the car doesn't really have any top speed difference, but the two drive modes feel different. And the reason why that is because, again, we're not utilizing the motor's sensor position on the end bell as a timing calculation. Dual mode's a lot more efficient. It runs cooler. Because of that, it provides a smoother power band to the driver. So if you're running on a really slick track, or even a really, really high grip track to where the cars want to wheelie a lot, or they're just too aggressive on the acceleration, going to dual mode might be a good adjustment. So what I typically do is have those timing profiles just ready to go on the onboard interface, so I can swap them on the fly without needing a phone or a hotwire or a computer. You can just do it using the onboard buttons and swap in the pit area. Typically, my Losi 22 with the 6.5 in it is in dual mode with the timing advance maxed out at 30, which is 100%, depending on your software and the older speed controllers. That is comparable to a blinky mode setup with the motor timing turned down to 0. So if you want to compare those back to back, as close as you can get them, that's how you would do that. Yeah, data logging. So if you guys have questions about data logging, ask some specific questions. I don't want to really go over the entire slideshow I have for the Tekin Clinic because we want to have a bunch of people log in for that in the next couple of days. But if you got some specific questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. So please fire away. All right, we got about 20 some odd viewers of you guys going on, so if you guys have questions, I'm here to answer them. So please ask a couple questions so we can keep the conversation going. It doesn't necessarily have to be RC related, but I'm more than happy to answer questions. It doesn't have to just be Tekin. It can be about any of my sponsors products. Tekin, J Concepts, KO Propo, ProTech, A-Main Hobbies, anything. Ask away. Okay, what e-truggy do you run and what motor? Okay, so I typically run the Losi e-truggy just because the guys at Losi help me out quite a bit. We've got I'm lucky enough to be friends and have conversations with a lot of the guys at the Losi factory like Adam Drake. So I run a Losi e-truggy right now. I still have the 2.0, simply because the 8-scale electric out here where I'm at isn't very big. And I 99% of the time run the Tekin T8 2000 kV with the RX-8 Gen 2 on 4S. Typically it's geared 1545, and I honestly haven't touched that truggy or that gearing or that motor for that matter for about 2 years now. I've won a lot of races with it. It's been a really good truck for me. For the most part, it just basically has a slight push, but honestly they're easy to drive that way, so you can huck it around and do whatever. But I've had no problems making runtime even back when we ran 5,000 milliamp hour battery. So good truck for me. Really enjoyed running it. It's actually one of my favorite classes. Okay, I mentioned weight during a previous question. What things do you consider, if any, regarding the weight on your vehicles? Typically, because I pretty much exclusively try to run mod, not stock or even super stock for that matter, I basically don't worry about the weight too much of my cars, and with the exception of how they're handling. Like right now, my Losi 22 SCT truck's pretty modified it out. I've got the Kyosho steering rack mod. I actually cut the rear deck brace on the shock tower to allow the chassis to flex a little bit. And I actually run a ProTech square pack in there, shoved quite a ways forward, just because what I have found with that truck, for example, is it has, if you run the battery far back, it's got a little pendulum effect. So when it breaks loose, you pretty much can never recover it. My 8 scale, for example, though, I try to run that at as minimum weight as I can, just because I like the T8i 1950 motor on 4S. I find that to be the smoothest, the easiest to drive, and for me, I get the best lap times out of it. So my 8 scale car is always floating around minimum weight. Anything I can do to get that thing to be as lowest as possible while still being legal, I will do it. Can I get on my gearing? I think on my low CD truggy it's 1545, and on my T8i 1950, I actually wasn't running a low C buggy at the time. I was running a Techno, and I want to say I had a 17 tooth pinion on it. But again, that had a 200-foot straightaway, so keep that in mind. Marvette Brown. Can you get a printout? I need a better question than that. Can I get a printout of what, Marvette? Okay, so here's a question we get asked quite a bit, and I will answer it to the best of my ability. Yes, if you run extremely low C-rated batteries, you can damage a speed controller. And the reason why this happens is because low C-rated batteries under a high amplitude condition create an extreme amount of what's called ripple current. Ripple current is the phenomenon of where the battery voltage at a steady state, for example, let's say it's 4S, it's 14.8 volts nominal. When you start grabbing a load on this, the 14.8 volts will drop down to 12 volts, back up a little bit, back down to 12 volts. This up and down motion on the voltage rail is called ripple current. The more of this you have, the more you're going to overwhelm the capacitance of the speed controller, and eventually it can misfire, it can saturate coils in the motor, it can cause a lot of problems. But basically, you only have this problem on a poor rated battery. So a lot of batteries are just getting kind of out of control right now. But if you have a battery that's a true 40C battery under a solid condition, the ripple current's pretty minor. But if you've got a battery, for example, that says it's 70C burst, it might be 70C burst, but the battery's only rated for 20C continuous. A 20C continuous in an 8 scale buggy, for example, is a horrible battery to run because the voltage rail will be up and down all over the place, and that can eventually damage the speed controller by overheating it, blowing the internal capacitors in it. Can cause a lot of problems. So definitely we only recommend 40C or higher, and that's continuous amp draw, not burst. There we go. So can you get printout data from your data logger? Yes, you can print the data logger out. We are working on more features to allow other things to happen with those printouts, as well as setting one over the top of each other. You can open multiple windows of a data logger. So you can have, for example, 2 different windows of a data logger open, so you can compare run 1 to run 2 and watch them there simultaneously. And we are working to be able to transpose them over the top of each other. But that's a future feature. So we're working on it. What's Tegan got coming out new? We're working on some microsystem stuff. We are working always on the future products. We're always watching the market and seeing what else we can come out with. Nothing I can really give out too many details, but you probably will start seeing some team drivers be testing some stuff here in the next couple of months. If you're lucky enough to be around them and they're testing it and they actually let you see it. But for the most part, nothing we can talk about, unfortunately, James. Right now we're kind of working on some stuff quietly. Usually when we do big releases, they're at major trade shows like RCX or the iHobby show in Chicago. So usually we kind of focus on those for goals and bring out the new equipment around that time. Oh, this will be a fun question to ask. Did Tegan go after Ryan Mayfield? Yes, I can honestly tell you that I did reach out to Ryan Mayfield as soon as I heard or thought there might be a problem going on there with him and Associated and Reedy and LRP. But I won't discuss the conversation that we had at some point. So, but yes, we did make an attempt to go. I'd love to have Ryan Mayfield on the team. He actually did win a national title in 8 scale, I think back in 2008 or 9 or something like that over at NorCal Hobbies. He ran a T8 motor in his Associated LRP powered car and actually beat people up with it. It was pretty cool. And he actually was nice enough to mention it in the sponsorship readouts, which was really cool. Very top class act guy. I like that guy. I'll see him in a couple days up here. Hey, what's happening, Joe Ferguson? A couple years ago, we discussed Tegan experimenting with waterproof electronics. Is that something that is still being looked into, maybe for something like the FXR that does not have the same heat concerns as an RX-8? Yeah, we're looking at waterproof electronics across the board, actually. The RX-8 is pretty well set up to be waterproof for the most part. It will have to be a case change, but for the most part, considering it has an external fan, It wouldn't be super hard to waterproof it and just make sure the important stuff stays out. What you're going to find, though, like I was mentioning earlier, was that when it comes to brushless electronics and sensored systems, it's not so much the speed controller being submerged that's the issue, it's the sensor system. So really, the focus is going to be on getting a sealed sensor harness setup working for all those speed controllers. The FXR is a lot easier, obviously, because it's brushed. And so, yes, you will start seeing most likely some waterproofed electronics coming from Tekin. But again, I can't comment on when or where or which one's going to come out first. So hopefully soon. So I know some other guys were asking about some data logging questions. I know a lot of guys are running stock using the data logger features are not exactly sure how to use that. So if you guys got specific questions on what I'm looking for when I'm looking at the data logs, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. Also, I know a lot of guys have Android operating system questions or how to use the app and stuff like that. So if you got questions about that, please ask away. What steps would you suggest in caring for my 35 Turn Pro and my SCX10? They're rebuildable. How often I should rebuild it? Okay. In rock crawling, when you're running brush stuff, one of the most important things to consider is it getting wet, and is it getting wet, is it getting submerged? As most of you guys know, when you get a DC motor, a brush motor submerged in water, the water actually acts as an abrasive. So it severely wears out that motor while it's under power under the water. If you do run into the water through a lake crossing or a creek or something like this, my suggestion is as soon as you're able to, get that motor apart, clean it out with motor cleaner, brush the brushes down with a good calm stick, lubricate the bearings. They used to have calm drops and things like this that actually keep the brushes lubricated, because the brush does have graphite in it. It really should be able to lubricate itself. However, what you do find is you will find the brush face will have a very, very sharp edge on it. And so what you would want to do is knock the edge of the leading edge of the brush and the trailing edge of the brush lightly down with a file, and that'll help to keep the arcing down. It'll also help as the armature and the face of the comm comes into contact with that. It gives it a leading edge safety lip. In other words, it won't snag the edge of those segments. There's 3 segments on a brushed motor and on the comm face, and so that slight taper on that brush will help the leading edge kind of bump over that and not grab. As far as motor maintenance goes, it depends on what you're running in, how much collaring you're doing. If you stall your motor quite a bit in a run, for example, you can typically burn up the brushes, and they'll end up turning blue and purple. Always watch your comm face. If it starts to get heavily grooved, or worse yet, pitted, you definitely need to take it apart and hit it with a comm lathe. I know a lot of guys don't have those, but ultimately that's what you need to be doing. Brush motors will last the longest as you can get them to last, as long as you keep the comm face nice and smooth and shiny, and your brushes at least full length or down. I would start replacing them once they get to about 60% long, and I would chuck them. Brushes are cheap, so don't be afraid to replace them. Okay, here's a sponsorship question, which is a good thing to start on. Lots of people have questions about that. What advice do I have for them to get sponsors? Do I look at race wins, traveling to other trucks? Okay, so this is a pretty general question, so I'm glad somebody asked it, because I'm sure it'll lead into more questions. Typically, what I look for in a driver is I look for almost a dedication level. I look to see how much they're traveling, where they're traveling. Are they just traveling in their region, around their region? Do they go from one state to the other? How often they race, their results at that race. And then I start to look into to try to see as much as I can what kind of person they are. So yes, I will actually pop onto social media and see what kind of posts and stuff that they have. Do they have vulgar language? Do they do some obnoxious stuff? Should they be in jail, for example? I just haven't gotten caught yet. But no, mostly it's results. If I get a vibe from them that they're a good person around the track, I will contact the local racetrack race directors, the hobby shop owners, and see what kind of feedback that they can give me. Race results is obviously a good thing to have, but a lot of it has to do with having a good mix. Being top 3, top 4 is nice. Being really helpful around the pits is nice. Being someone who can influence sales in your area is actually one of the biggest reasons we sponsor drivers. So if I can get a good mix of all 3, the guy's relatively fast, he's a good person, hobby shop owners like him, race directors like him, and he can actually influence sales in his area because of those ladders, then that's somebody I might want to look at for sponsorship. I recommend keeping track of your results, even if it's as simple as taking a photograph of your race results every week when you're racing club races, big races. Just take a snap photo of the heat sheet. save it for later. Those are important because when you go to make your racer's resume, it's nice to have that information to go down and build that resume, because that's the other thing that we look at really well is how much time did they dedicate to building me that racer's resume. 9 times out of 10, I don't know these people. I've never met them. I'm only going to find out about them on online and that racer's resume. Maybe a phone conversation I get to talk to one of their friends or a race director, but that's their first impressions, that resume. So if they've got a lot of good information, the details are there, it's well read, it looks together, all the information's there and I can read it well, that shows me that they're dedicated to their racing and dedicated enough that we might want to consider them for a driver. What I've also found is that the guys who spend a good time on the racer's resume, 9 times out of 10, also take that same time and dedication to have a good race program. Their cars are clean, they're well put together, they're not breaking down all the time because of mechanical failures, they represent really well at the track. So what I find in the resume is usually what I find at the racetrack. I can find the fastest guy in the world, but he might not be able to put a resume together. And that also generally means he's not very approachable, and people may not take what he runs to be influential. You'll see a lot of pro guys that, yes, they're pro, yes, they're fast, and we all know they could win with a Tyco car from Walmart, but if they're not approachable and they can't influence sales, they're not really that helpful. And when you've actually seen a lot of guys like that, they've kind of gone away over time. You've got to be all of those things, and you've got to do them all well. Another crawler question from Joe. What is the smallest gauge wire for a 35-turn system, Rock 412? Okay, so good question, and this this pertains to rock crawling and racing for that matter, because we get that question there as well. In 10-scale off-road racing, for example, which is my area of expertise, I generally always run 12-gauge wire and mod. However, in certain conditions where stock, for example, you're really worried about weight, you can run 14-gauge, and this is how I determine it. If after a full run, I pull the car in and those wires are hotter than the motor temperature, the wire gauge is not sufficient. The motor wires for the ABC wire should never be as hot or hotter than the motor itself. And I don't check them right at the tabs on the can. That would be silly because of ambient heat or radiant heat from the motor. But if you go check them halfway between the speed controller and the motor, and they're the same temperature or higher than the motor itself, the wires are too small. As long as you're not hitting those temperature factors, you're okay to run smaller wire. What I've typically found is anything below 14 gauge is usually too small. You can run 16, it's out there, but the only time I've ever seen that even be remotely helpful is in 12 scale stock racing, because they don't want the pod to be held up by the stiffness of the wire. I would never run 16 gauge in a rock crawler personally, but by all means, as long as the motor wires aren't getting hot, you should be fine. Yeah, thanks for coming over here and watching. I'm happy to help everyone out as best I can. This is just another avenue for us to use to help out all the Tekin customers and users, and I appreciate everyone coming online and help me test this out. It's a new feature, so I'm learning as we go. Yes, Howard and Mark Kimley are actually really good drivers. I haven't got a chance to meet them yet, but I've talked to them on the phone a couple different times, and yeah, they're really good guys. We're really happy to have them on our team, so I'm glad you had a positive experience as well. You have a Pro 2 motor, can this use be in four-wheel drive buggy? Yes, the RSX is capable of running the Pro 2 motor as long as your car or model is under 4 pounds, in which case your four-wheel drive buggy typically would. So yeah, I ran a Pro 2 motor on the Durango car when I had it back then. It's a beast, it's a monster, but yes, it's fun to drive. But yes, by all means, you can run a Pro 2 in a four-wheel drive buggy with the RSX, again, as long as your car's under 4 pounds. And do not run it in censored-only mode. Don't turbo boost it, don't timing boost it. Run it in dual mode, just like the setups we have posted on the website. Am I aware of any big series running on the Midwest? Yeah, in the Midwest, actually, you guys used to have the RC Pro series, but it's changed hands a couple times, so it's gotten smaller every time it's changed hands. The Midwest has a little bit of a space between all the racing. CRC Classic in January is usually around that time. I'm not really sure why the Midwest hasn't gotten up to the base that the East Coast and the West Coast has typically, other than the fact that I can tell you that on the West Coast and the East Coast, for example, California and Florida, there's a lot of RC manufacturers. So on the West Coast, for example, you've obviously got Associated, Losi. You've got some offices here like AKA, Proline. A lot of the other electronics manufacturers are on the West Coast as well, versus where you go to East Coast. Now you're looking at J Concepts is probably the biggest one out there in Florida. A couple other smaller companies are also out in Florida. So that's probably why you see a lot more bigger races on each edge of the coast. However, in my travels, I have found a lot of good racing in Texas. And there's a lot of tracks, and that's a big state, so they've got a lot of big races. Typically more nitro, I think, than electric, but they do have big racing there. I would honestly contact your local Roar regional guys to try to figure out why there's not enough big enough series in that area. But all of it's going to start with race directors and getting those guys all on the same page to have big racing. Am I planning to attend the 110 scale Roar National? Yes, I will be there. So I'll be able to meet all my East Coast drivers that I haven't met before, and I should be there setting up all the equipment for the pro drivers like Ryan Lutz and the rest of them, as well as being there for helping out anybody using Tekin that isn't a driver. You'll pretty much get driver treatment while I'm there, which is what Tekin's all about. We support our customers the same way we support our team drivers. So yeah, if you've got Tekin stuff and you need help with it while you're at the Nationals, by all means, stop by the Tekin booth, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Do I suggest making a solid connection between the motor and ESC and two-wheel drive? Yeah, always, actually. I'm not a big fan of bullet connectors on the motor wires for the ABC wires at all, or any connectors for that matter. Any connection that I don't necessarily need is the potential for added resistance and the potential for a failure point. So when it comes to racing, I will always have my motor directly wired to the speed controller every single time. If, for example, one of those leads, the A, B, or C wire, was to come off that connection while you were driving, you have the potential to destroy your speed controller and or battery right away. So it's a bad thing. So yeah, no connections on the ABC wires for the motor. All right, guys, we got some more questions. All right, guys. Well, we don't have a couple more questions drawn here in the next couple of minutes. I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. So if you got some questions, you want to get some answers, knock them out real quick. Otherwise, I'm going to be closing it up, and I just appreciate everyone coming over and viewing it with us. And thanks for helping me learn Google Hangout Air on your time. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, Brian Parker. I was hoping it'd be a cool feature. I hope more people would enjoy it. But yeah, I mean, Tekins are always trying to innovate and bring our customers a different outlet to learn some stuff, and maybe having a couple of interviews with us that work at Tekin would be kind of cool. So I figured I'd give it a shot, and we will be having the Tekin Clinic broadcast from A-Main Hobbies and the Outback Raceway, which happens to be the indoor 2014 J Concepts Indoor Summer Nationals round 3, I believe. I'll be attending that race as well, which is Ryan Mayfield's first run on the TLR cars. But we will be broadcasting the Tekin Clinic, in which case I will go over a PowerPoint that shows a couple day logger runs, how we're making adjustments, what we're looking for in those adjustments. So by all means, please tune in and watch that. If you aren't able to tune in and watch it live, it will be broadcast to our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later as well. So it's a pretty cool thing. Okay, so favorite short course tires and wheels for a hard-packed, slightly wet dirt. I typically run DE Racing wheels. They're one of my sponsors, and I am also sponsored by J Concepts, which I've been really, really happy with their tires, changing from the last brand. If it is an indoor type of dirt that is slightly wet, I will typically run a gold compound J Concepts, either the dirt webs or the barcodes. And I have actually found personally that the dirt webs have a lot more forward bite than the barcode. And typically this is a little more overall locked in tire. If the dust is down, the dirt web will be faster. But if there's a little bit more dust on top of the dirt, the barcode is a little bit more consistent for me anyways. I've been finding that I run the pressure points typically up front on regardless of the rear tire. So pressure points in front, either dirt webs or barcodes, and gold compound on a wet dirt track for me in short course. Will I be posting the PowerPoint somewhere for later review? Yeah, we are going to be doing, again, streaming the Tekin Clinic as well, which will obviously automatically upload to YouTube. So you will be able to view that whole streaming live broadcast, as well as having the people there at the clinic asking questions live. And so you can always watch that for a later date. If I get enough requests for it, yeah, we can do just another one of these Hangouts like this where everyone has a little Q&A. And we can answer the questions right on the Tekin Clinic at that time. It's a little hard for me to do the Tekin Clinic PowerPoint and do the Q&A texting and answering questions, but if I can get some help, we can do that for sure. I can always actually take the PowerPoint and go over it and write a how-to article using it as well. We've got one on the website now, but as I learn and as this whole clinic evolves, we'll certainly build on it and post it up as we go. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, Dominic. Hopefully you learned something. But I do appreciate your time as well, so thanks for stopping by and helping me learn Google Hangouts there. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day. Again, likewise, Matt Miller, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something as well, and hopefully everyone's able to make the Tekin Clinic in a couple of days and learn some more stuff. Yeah, always helping to help out, Robert. Appreciate you guys stopping by. Thanks. Any tips on racing with Lutz? Yeah, tease him a little bit. I don't know. I always give him handfuls of health food, kind of rib him a little bit for his pink cars, but for the most part, just try to follow him. If you're able to get a run with him, do your best to stay behind him or right on his bumper, basically, and just run around the track with him. I've actually gone pretty fast chasing him down in qualifiers and practice and stuff like that. The guy's an amazing driver. We're happy to have him. He drives full strapped all the time. He's super fast. He's got really amazing car control, and I can't generally race with him. I've got moments and stuff like that, but he's fast. So by all means, just follow his lines, see how he's jumping things. He's a really approachable guy, always willing to help. So if you do need help, by all means, ask him. He's pretty well versed in all his Tekin stuff as well. So if you have a Tekin question, I'm sure he can help you out with it. And if not, he knows how to reach me and get a hold of me at the race. So I'd be more than happy to answer that question as well. But yeah, he's a really great guy. We're happy to have him. So how to beat him? Yeah, just got to go faster. Yes, there you go. There's my lovely wife. Yeah, no one can beat Lutz. Yeah, that's true sometimes. I beat him one time, but I'm pretty sure it's because he broke. But I still beat him. All right, guys, we still have quite a few viewers watching right now. Looks like 25, 30 of you guys watching. So if you guys got some questions, please ask away. If not, I'll be shutting it down here in the next 7 minutes.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of lag.
Yeah, Tegan's really big about military support. We really support our men and women, both current and retired. Everyone at Tegan's very, very, very active in supporting our military guys. For those of you who don't know, Tegan's got a really nice, substantial military discount for all you men and women that serve. If you guys have questions about it, shoot me an email, rpike@teamtegan.com, and I'll be helping to get you involved with our sales staff so you can utilize that discount. But yeah, we obviously enjoy the freedom those guys provide for us. So yeah, we definitely like supporting the military. What class did I run at Axial Fest? Because it was my first Axial Fest, I didn't feel comfortable dropping into Ultra or running the scale class that much. The car I had wasn't really meant for that, so I took a Wraith, and I was lucky enough to have it hopped up with a bunch of Vanquish products, so thanks to those guys at Vanquish for hooking me up with that and giving me a bulletproof rig to run, and I ended up running the G6 in the Axial Wraith class. and I had a lot of fun doing it. Definitely a different experience than racing a big race at like the Nationals or the J Concepts like I'm going to this weekend. A lot more laid back, a lot of fun though. I enjoyed it. It was definitely nice to go outdoors, crawling around in the nature like that in the dark and stuff like that was pretty cool. And then finding the Yetis was also a lot of fun. But got to meet a lot of good people, and that was awesome to see so much teaking being used in that rock crawler industry. And we look forward to going again next year. Hopefully, I'm able to attend. Usually, the Axial Fest lands on the same race weekend as another big event that I typically attend, but it hasn't happened this year, so hopefully it doesn't happen again next year. All right, guys, it's a couple more minutes of being online. So if you guys have some questions, please fire them away. I'm going to shut it down in about 3 or 4 minutes. So hopefully you guys got some questions to ask. Please ask away. Can I share more information about the Tegan Clinic? Yeah, so at the Tegan Clinic, we're going to go over some basic features, how to use it with an Android device, how to use it with your PC, and basically go over how I use that tool to reduce lap times. Typically what I'm looking to do is get some base information on the car and the driver, talk to the driver, see how they feel about the car, watch the car if I'm able to, and then basically ask the driver what he wants to get out of the car, which is usually faster, and we'll start making changes from there. I look at the RPM, battery voltage, speed of temp, motor temp, and we'll start whittling away at small changes to basically drop those lap times with this data logger, always using the data logger against the lap times to make sure those changes are having the desired effect. I always race for lap times, and as long as my lap times are going down and I know the changes that I'm doing are helping that, we keep making changes. But the Tegan Clinic will go over all those things. I'll show you a couple of runs that we did at the IIC race last year. Some things I found, for example, I was able to find a guy who had a battery voltage issue. And we go over on how I found that and how I determined it, as well as the end results after fixing that issue in his car and the benefit from the data logger, which we wouldn't have been able to find any other way. So it's kind of a cool feature. So another sponsorship question. Expanding on what you said, does time racing get put in the mix? 1 year versus 10? Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I definitely look at racing experience as time spent, kind of looking at how much time you've got earned. Don't get me wrong, some guys are natural at RC racing. They pick it up and hit the ground running, and they're fast right away, which is awesome. And we definitely do look at those guys for sponsorship. However, I've also seen guys be super fast for a year and they lose interest, especially young kids. So we definitely take all that into account. Experience is definitely a nice thing to have. And what I've also found in looking at all the racers' resumes and sponsoring different people is that if you've got a guy who's been in the hobby for 10 years, generally speaking, he is pretty influential in the area. As long as that guy's typically been fast the entire time, he's usually well liked by the hobby shop owners and the race directors, and he's usually pretty plugged in. Guys like that are called lifers to me, which means they're in the hobby, they enjoy it, they live it. And so, yeah, definitely we sponsor quite a few of those guys. Again, it's not always about being fast or winning all the races. It's do you help influence sales in your area? So, yes, time spent does definitely help in that condition. Okay. It's sponsored by a tire company but having problems with the rubber where pins are being torn off and running clean laps and right compound. Are you able to run a different brand? Okay, so I actually, some of you may or may not know, I was actually the team driver for Panther Tires as well. And so I would imagine this is how most other tire manufacturers look at this. If I'm the sponsor of a driver for tires and that driver is having a tire issue, that either is the pins blowing off the tire, if it's a mold issue, is it a rubber issue, is it just a bad tire choice, for example. Those are all things I will discuss with the driver individually long before we decide to let the driver run a different brand tire. And in my opinion, I'm kind of old school on this. Sponsorship is being sponsored. You are choosing to be sponsored by that company, which means you are choosing to run the products in your race program that they provide you. Now, that might not always be the fastest product at any given time, However, that is something you should definitely discuss with your sponsor and get a plan of attack on how to fix it. So for example, let's say tire manufacturer A has a tire and you're having problems with excessive wear, for maybe it doesn't make a 45-minute gas main, it only makes 25 minutes. And there isn't another tire that can produce the same lap times as that specific tire, nor a different compound choice that can prevent those, to provide those lap times as well. But yet another tire manufacturer, say tire manufacturer B and tire manufacturer C, offer a product that is able to make those lap times as well as last a full main. That is something you should discuss with your tire manufacturer. I know how I feel about it is if I find out a sponsored driver chose to change to another manufacturer's product without discussing with me first, it's basically grounds for immediate dismissal. They'd have to have a really good reason. I basically provide all my team drivers with my cell phone number so they can reach me at any time, on any day, in multiple ways, like Facebook, Google+, email, cell phone, text messages. There's no excuse. And basically because sometimes those are extremely important decisions at extremely important big races, and those decisions should be made by you and the sponsor, not you alone. Hopefully that answers your question. All right, guys, we've still got about 15, 20 of you online, so if you got a couple more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. But if I don't get any questions in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. I do appreciate all those you guys have stopped in to ask questions as well as help view this. So I appreciate your time as well. I know it's hard to come by sometimes, so I appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, if you talk to your team manager and they had an issue with a tire mold problem, then again, that's definitely the first step you should have taken. They've obviously got something going on with the tire mold, in which case, if you need to continue racing, obviously, and you need to have a solution between now and then, they should be able to come up with a solution with you on that particular problem. Typically, what I would have done at some point was either allowed you to run the other manufacturer's tire until they fixed the mold problem, and then obviously immediately provided you with a fixed tire issue at that point. So if you're one of those drivers that's experiencing this problem and you're continually having that issue, once I fixed the tire mold, I would make sure that you had tires to test to verify that the repaired mold actually cured the problem. So again, you need to work with your manufacturer and your team manager to resolve those issues, but typically that's part of being on the team. You guys choose what to do as a team, not just an individual user. Anytime I've got a driver that goes out and does something on his own, he's basically no longer choosing to be part of the team. So that's usually where we come into problems and rough spots and guys get dismissed from the team, but that's how I generally look at it. All right, guys. Well, it looks like I'm out of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up for the evening. Go enjoy time with my wife and maybe go grab some dinner. So I appreciate everyone coming online and watching and asking questions and helping me broadcast this. Again, I appreciate your time. I know it's hard to come by sometimes. And please, everyone, stop by and watch again in the next 2 days. Again, on Thursday at 1 o'clock, I think it is. We're going to have the Tekin Clinic also streamed online. And if you aren't able to watch it live, you're definitely able to pick that up on our YouTube channel. We're going to basically have a Tekin Clinic going over the data logger and all the new features of the RS Gen 2 and all the other Gen 2 speed controllers. And it'll also have the PowerPoint presentation on how to use a data logger and what I'm looking for to make changes. And again, if you aren't able to watch live, that will be broadcast automatically to our YouTube channel so you can watch it at a later time. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I appreciate it. Again, take care.